Thin Wood Walls, Part 3. Behind thin wood walls, freedoms die, pasts dim, but dreams still ramble free. Chapter 14. October arrived. The sun continued to shine, but a weeping cloud hung over our family. I finally gave up on a dim hope that the Army would send Mike back. He hadn't flunked his physical. He wasn't colorblind or tone deaf or flat-footed or afraid of loud noises or tough sergeants. If he was any of those things, the Army had overlooked them. They'd seen the fire in his eyes. Dad was still a memory, fading. His photos, in which he never changed, his letters, yellowing on the wall, were all we had of him. I've gotten used to Dad's being gone. I told Mom one day as I reread one of his letters for the 100th time. He hasn't been here for anything. I expected Mom to get angry. I was angry at myself for feelings. Instead, she gave me a sad smile. It's not his fault, Joseph. Maybe Mike wouldn't be gone if Dad had been here. Put yourself in his place, she said. From time to time, I find myself disappointed in him for being gone. I resent having to fill his shoes while still wearing mine. But then, I think about what he has suffered. Imagine how powerless he must feel. Tried to imagine it, I kicked myself. I wanted to kick the men who were keeping him imprisoned. There was a knock on our door. I opened it. May stood there, smiling with her eyes, trying not to smile with her mouth. Come in, I said. The weather had turned cool and windy. I felt a chill. She said hello to Mom, who invited her to sit at the table and have tea. I sat down with them. What is it? I said. Her eyes danced. She was inside, but her cheeks still glowed. My family has a sponsor. My mom smiled. Wonderful. I tried smiling. How? The Quakers helped us. Where will you go? Mom said. Oregon, May said. A town called Ontario, like the province in Canada. When? I said. Soon, she said. A week. A week? She couldn't stop her smile now. I felt myself smiling with her. Something good was happening, and sad, and bittersweet. Your father has a job, Mom said. A service station, May said, and we'll be working on the farm where we'll live. A farm, a real house, a real school, a dad who comes home every night. My dream. I sipped tea and let May and Mom talk. May's mom came over and the room filled with chatter. Mom wanted to know every detail. I didn't. Finally, they left. I sat there thinking about asking Mom when she would try to get us a sponsor. But with Dad locked up and Grandmother a yes-no, what chance would we have? I put on my coat and left our apartment without saying anything. Patience, I told myself. I walked until my legs grew weary and darkness had fallen over the camp. By the time I returned, Mom had gone to work. Grandmother was waiting for me, waiting to go to dinner. My patience was gone. Why hasn't Mom tried to get us a sponsor? I asked Grandmother as we left the apartment at a slow shuffle. She took my arm, moving in close to me. I could feel the pressure of her thin fingers through my coat sleeve. She didn't answer at first, and I looked over at her, noticing for the first time that I was taller than she was. What makes you think she has not? She said finally. She has? Yes. And? It will be difficult while your father is away. She has learned. Not unexpected news. Once he is with us, I said, our prospects improve. Yours too? Yes, I am an old woman. The government might decide I am harmless, even if I answered no on the form. We were only halfway to the mess hall, late. People were already returning to their barracks. We had only one speed. Why didn't Mom say anything? She knew that we were not in a good situation. She did not want to raise your hopes and then crush them. Mom didn't want to raise my hopes, but now I felt them rise a little higher. If Dad returned, if the government forgave Grandmother her answer, if we found a sponsor, we would have a chance for freedom. Lots of ifs, but even so, I tried to pick up our pace a little. I suddenly realized I was hungry. The next day, I told Sandy about May's news. On the following Saturday, he asked me if I wanted to get out for a hike before winter set in. I was ready to go before he finished his question. I almost asked if May could come, but I changed my mind. I would let her fill someone else's car with her talk of freedom. Our first stop was a lake. I was surprised to see it in the middle of this dry country, and more surprised when Sandy told me it was Tule Lake. I thought all along that whatever lake had given this place its name had long ago disappeared. Next, we drove to the base of Castle Rock, where we parked the Jeep. Sandy knew where he was going, up. Hard work for someone who was used to doing a lot of sitting, me. He picked out a trail and I followed him. Sweating, breathing hard. I smelled dust and the sharp perfume of desert plants. The higher we got, the more I could see. I looked down at the camp, the rows of barracks stretching into the distance, the barbed wire and guard towers and people moving from place to place like rats in a maze. We hiked to the peak and sat, sharing sandwiches and candy bars and cokes near a big white cross some internees had been allowed to erect. The view was beautiful, but unsettling. In one direction, camp. In the other, mountains, forests, and thousands of acres of land without fences. But I couldn't go there. My family couldn't go there. Halfway down the rocky trail, Sandy suddenly held up his arm. "Shh," he hissed. I stopped just off his right shoulder and looked, not seeing. He snapped open his holster and slowly drew out his pistol, and I followed his gaze to the object of his attention, a snake. 8 feet away, a fat snake had crawled out onto a flat rock in the middle of the trail and coiled itself in the sun. "Rattlesnake?" I whispered. As if in an answer, the snake raised its head and looked at us and gave off a sound I'd heard before only in my imagination. The sound of marbles spilling onto hard ground. "Big one." Sandy cocked his pistol and leveled it at the snake. But the rattler didn't flinch. Its tongue slipped in and out, testing the air. It didn't know about the power of a gun. But in my imagination, I decided the snake was too prideful, or maybe too accepting, to try to escape. For some reason, I thought of Dad, being led away in his pajamas, walking with his head held high. Perhaps this snake believed in the words, "Shikata ganai." But those words had nothing left for Dad. "Run," I thought to myself. "Slither away." "Don't shoot him," I said in a loud voice, hoping to warn the snake. It didn't budge. "No," Sandy said. "He can't hurt us from there." I'd read enough of Mike's Zane Grey westerns to know rattlers couldn't fly. I hoped Zane Grey wasn't wrong. Sandy glanced at me. He smiled. "You're right," he said slowly. Slowly, eyes on the rattler, gun still raised, he bent and picked up a golf ball-sized stone. He lobbed it underhand toward the snake's rock. It hit inches away and clattered to the ground. The rattler tensed, then it dropped its head and uncoiled gracefully and moved away, disappearing into the hillsides, cracks, and crevices. Sandy uncocked his pistol and holstered it. I took one last look at the forest in the distance while my heart slowed. Then we continued down. Later that day, I made a journal entry about a snake with dignity, and Dad, who had twice as much. Most of me was proud of the way he was, but a small voice inside me wondered what things would have been like for us if he had been different. Not a leader, not a teacher, not honest about who he was or what he'd done. Would he be here with us now? Would we be free? On the evening before May was to leave, we brought out the marbles and played it until it was too dark to see. She didn't talk at all about her leaving, where they were going, and I was ashamed that I had been jealous of her good fortune. I won one game on my own. She let me win 3 others. I knew that what she was doing, missing on purpose, but I admired how close she came, and I didn't say anything. It was her going away gift to me. I had nothing to give her but a poem I had written the night before. Rare pearl, sharpshooter, digger of shells, a smile that fills an empty heart. She took the scrap of lined paper and went to the closest circle of light. Reading the poem shouldn't have taken more than 5 seconds, but her head stayed down. When she looked up, her eyes were watery, and I had to turn away. First Ray, then Philip, and now May. I gathered up the marbles, hers and mine, and put them in their sacks. I peered down as May came up beside me. In the dark, I couldn't make out the circle we'd drawn in the dirt. It had disappeared, just like my small circle of friends. I walked her back to her barracks. She touched my cheek with her fingers and went inside. A smiling man in a suit arrived in a dusty black Lincoln the next morning. May and her family loaded their belongings in the trunk, while some of us, friends from the block, from the White River Valley, helped or watched. It took no time. Then they were inside the big car, saying goodbye through the rolled-down windows. The Lincoln crept away, easing through small clusters of onlookers. I walked along, keeping May's face in view as she looked out the back window. Too late, I remembered a promise I hadn't kept, to teach her to whistle. At the gate, the car stopped while the guard checked papers and waved them on. May's face disappeared in a cloud of dust. I touched my cheek where her fingers had been. Mike's first letter came the next day. It was short, a half page of his new stationery, but I made up for it by reading it again and again. He was busy, he said, learning to be a soldier. He'd been assigned to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the All-Nisei unit. The Army had finally let them hand in the toy guns they'd been issued when they arrived, and entrusted them with real ones. The food reminded him of Thule food, only worse. He'd met other guys from the Seattle area, and when they weren't too tired, they had a good time talking about home, where they might go. France, some of them were guessing. The recruits from Hawaii had come up with the motto for the 442nd, "Go for broke." It meant putting everything on the line. Mike missed us, he said. "Write to me, Joe," he said. Regimental Combat Team, go for broke. Impressive. But I didn't like Mike's being a part of it. I was hoping for White House Guard, or Special Assistant to the General who never leaves the States, or Regimental Latrine Team. I was hoping for a motto like, "Go for shelter," but Mike hadn't joined to do any of those things. I wrote back, telling him about the snake and May's leaving. I told him we were doing swell. I pinned his letter to the wall, opposite to the wall where Dad's letters hung. It looked lonesome by itself, so I cut out articles from newspapers and magazines about American flyers dropping bombs on German cities, American soldiers winning victories in Italy, and pinned them up too. They made me feel better. Maybe if we kept whipping the bad guys, the war would be over before Mike had to go. After I decorated the wall, I sat down and put some thoughts in my journal. They were thoughts about boys going to war who should be home, playing catch with their brothers. They were thoughts about going for broke. I came home from school one day in mid-October and found Mom and Grandmother talking, serious faces, lowered voices. "A farm worker has died," Mom told me. How? I had heard rumors, but no details. "A truck overturned," Mom said. "Bare tires," Grandmother said. "Bald," Mom said. "People are saying they should have been replaced long ago." "Someone should do something," Grandmother said. I pictured a worker crushed under a truck, or thrown, hurtling out and down like a Canada goose shot from the sky. Part of me was sickened as I thought of the dead man and his family. Part of me was pleased that Mom and Grandmother had brought me into their conversation of grown-up grief. The next day at breakfast, cold pancakes and Spam, the mess hall was filled with people and talk. I watched with Grandmother as farm workers sat, as they kept sitting, as their angry voices rose. Word spread, a strike. The farm workers were not going to work until conditions changed. And they didn't work for a week, 10 days. Strikebreakers were brought in to finish the harvest. They were paid $1 an hour instead of what the regular workers made, less than $1 a day. Anger swirled through the camp. Farm workers, no-nos. I walked back and forth to school alone, hoping the bad feelings wouldn't spill over on me. The situation worsened. The people in charge of Thule refused to follow a public funeral for the worker. On the first day of November, I sat outside our barracks and watched as hundreds of people marched past. "You stay out of the way," Mom said as she left for work. But I followed the noisy crowd to the administration building. Thousands of people were standing in the cold. A man got up and shouted out a speech and read a list of demands. Chanting began. It went on. Soldiers moved in, hundreds of them. armed with machine guns and rifles and bayonets. Some of them looked scared. Some looked angry. All looked ready to shoot. I moved back. I hurried to our room, wishing for better days. I remembered the last time I'd seen Dad, when he told me not to be afraid. Had he ever imagined anything like this? I was glad that May and her family had gotten out. On November 4th, Mom came home early, before supper, from her job. They had shut down her mess hall. "We will stay here tonight," she said. "Government people have been taking our food and feeding the strikebreakers. People are upset. There have been fights and attacks. Young men are roaming the camp. Soldiers are everywhere. I saw tanks moving." Grandmother shook her head. We stayed inside. I felt even more like a prisoner. We could hear movement and voices until late. I went to bed hungry. Our mess hall was open the next morning, but many other things, coal, garbage, warehouses, were shutting down. The strike had spread. I saw worry in Mom's brave eyes. I felt it too, like a chill from lingering too long at a drafty window. She made me stay home from school for a few days. When I finally went, the talk was all about the strike and what was going to happen. A curfew was on, which meant we couldn't be out at night. We could barely be out during the day without soldiers or wardens questioning us. Clubs were being disbanded, dances, athletics, almost all activities were canceled. They didn't want anyone gathering anywhere. And a stockade, barbed wire and guard towers, was going up around the jail to make room for the leaders of the strike. The camp was nearly paralyzed. The boredom I'd felt before was nothing like this. There was little to do but be scared. Days grew darker and colder. Snow fell. We spent more and more time in our room, dressed in sweaters and coats, trying to get by with the little coal we could get. I wanted more than ever to be out. Letters from Mike lifted my spirits. I pinned them up, along with new articles on the war in Europe. I inspired Grandmother, who tacked up articles of her own next to Dad's letters. She had clipped them from the Seattle newspapers before we'd left home, and saved them, like a cop saving the confessions of criminals. Those articles and their headlines had done as much as anything to guarantee we'd end up at Tule Lake and places like it. One article talked about raids on Jap sympathizers in the Seattle area and elsewhere. In another, the head of Washington State's American Legion said all Issei should be put in concentration camps. An article in the Seattle Times, headlined "Arrows of Fire," told the tall tale of arrow-shaped fires near Port Angeles, directing Japanese planes to their target, Seattle. When it was later discovered that the fires had been started by loggers burning slash, the Times didn't bother to retract the story. Grandmother kept clipping and saving articles, even after we were locked up. Her favorite contained a quote from General DeWitt to explain his support of internment. "A Jap's a Jap." Grandmother called him General Dimwit. Thanksgiving came. People puzzled over what to be thankful for. Grandmother invited Mr. and Mrs. Terada to our room for tea and cookies. They were grateful to be with us. I was thankful to have them. Christmas slipped past. Letters came from Mike and Dad, worried about what was happening at Tule. I worried more about them. I wrote back that we were safe. The new year, 1944, arrived. My wall filled with news of Allied struggles in Italy. One article told of a bloody battle at a place called Cassino, where Japanese Americans from Hawaii were making an outstanding contribution. Among other things, they were using their baseball skills to fire grenades at German positions, knocking the Nazis back on their heels. I prayed for a quick victory, in the battle and in the war. Mike wanted to prove his loyalty. He didn't have to prove anything to me. The government reinstituted the draft for Japanese American citizens in good standing. Which meant yes, Nisei would have to serve in the army even if they didn't volunteer, which brought more hard feelings and arguments and trouble to Tule, if that were possible. Mike was still training in the States. a place called Camp Shelby in Mississippi, but itching for a fight. The combat team had yet to see combat. The days grew longer and warmer as spring approached. People returned to the farms. The strike had ended, but the camp turned uglier, with no-nos gloating because they wouldn't be drafted and demanding the camp for themselves. I would have gladly given it to them. A letter came from Mike. He had gotten orders, overseas. He didn't know where, but he had 2-week furlough. He was coming to see us, to say goodbye. Bittersweet. I hung around the gate on the day he was to arrive. When I saw dust rising far down the road and the dark shape of a bus appeared and grew larger, my heart stalled. The gate opened. The bus growled through it and stopped. I hurried to the door. 2 white soldiers got off, MPs returning from Klamath Falls. Then another soldier, one I hardly recognized in his uniform and cap, stepped off. His face was dark and angled and older. His shoulders had broadened, but he knew me. Before I could move, he'd crossed the space between us and scooped me up as if I were a little kid and wrapped me in a big bear hug. "That's the last time I'll be able to do that," Mike said, and I got this sinking feeling in my chest as he set me down. I must have given him a worried look. "You're getting too big," he said. "Next time you can pick me up." He smiled, wide and easy. "Okay," I said, although I hadn't grown that much. "Where's Mom?" he said. "Grandmother?" "Mom's working," I said. "She'll be off soon. Grandmother's having a little trouble walking. She's waiting to see you in the room." I looked at him. A darker, smaller version of Sandy. Handsome, dashing, heroic. Things I'd once thought were important, but seeing Mike in uniform reminded me of other things. Years of not seeing him. Far-off bloody battles. Death. I should have reached across the table on registration day and changed his answers to no, no. Grandmother's sourness has settled in her legs. He picked up his bag and put his arm around me and smiled again. We started for the barracks, and for a moment everything seemed better. It didn't stay that way long. Mike was happy to hang around with us that day and the next. Happy to stay in our room, go to the mess hall, go to Mom's work so she could show him off to her friends, go to the canteen with me. But he was used to freedom now. On the 3rd day, he decided he wanted to go hike the farms. "I want to pretend I'm not under the government's thumb, for a little while," he said. I left school at noon. I had this idea that the guards would let me go with him. A crazy idea. We got as far as the gate. That was it. They wouldn't even let Mike out. "Not without an escort," an MP said. I couldn't believe it. "I'm in the Army," Mike said. "Same as you. I arrived without an escort. When I leave here, I'll leave without one. I'll be going to fight the war without one." "Sorry," the guy said. He looked as if he was. "What if I put on my uniform?" "Sorry," the MP repeated. "Regulations." Mike gave him a look, and for a minute I was afraid there was going to be trouble, but Mike turned and started away. "Come on, Joe," he said. "Maybe Sandy can do something," I said. "Sandy has a big heart, but he's a sergeant," Mike said. "Those orders were cooked up by someone with a small mind but lots of brass. Sandy can't do anything about it." I didn't argue. Mike was right. We went back to the room where Grandmother was making flowers. Her fingers danced through a pile of shells, searching for the perfect ones. I had made it hard for her. I hadn't gathered any since May had left. "I thought you were going for a walk, Michael," she said. I changed my mind. "Oh," she put down the shells and gave him a long look. "They won't let him go," I said, "not without a babysitter." I told her what had happened, while Mike stood at the window, looking out at dirt and guard towers and fences. She shook her head, and her jaw slid out and set. I had second thoughts about my decision to tell her. Mike's answer might have been better. "You are an American," she said to Mike's back. "A citizen." She stretched out the word like a snake, uncoiling and skimming across a warm rock. "You have shown what that means by joining the Army. Who knows what that decision will cost you?" "It's going to cost them," Mike said, turning toward us. "The Nazis will pay." "And who else?" Grandmother said. I couldn't help but wondering along with her. Who else? The question took my breath away. Mike sidestepped it with a shrug. Don't worry. But I did worry. I escaped to my journal. I wrote about the way Mike looked in his uniform, and fences, and Sandy, and long ago trains. I wrote about a wish, Mike and Sandy going to war together. I added a poem. A loyal heart beats, unseen, beneath khaki skin. Can none hear it sing? The next day, Sandy took us through the gate. He drove us to where he and I had gone before, Tule Lake, Castle Rock. We walked the same trail, but it wasn't the same. Mike took it all in, but he was quiet, and I wasn't much company. My mind was already on his leaving. We got to the top, he wandered off by himself and sat down on a slab of stone and stared off toward the trees and Mount Shasta in the distance, as if we weren't there. I have to be going soon too, Sandy told me. Where? The war. They figure I've seen enough of this one. You'll have to fight? It's why I joined. Can you go where Mike goes? Look after him, kind of? I'd like to, Joe, but I've got no say, and I don't know where Mike's going. But I'm guessing Europe. I'm heading in the other direction. To fight Japan? Sandy nodded. And Mike will be fighting the Nazis? He's a tough guy. I wouldn't want to be in their boots. Sandy was right. Mike was tough. But did that matter to a bullet? We started back down. I took the lead, looking for snakes, hoping for something to change the feeling in the air. In me. But there were no snakes. Nothing changed. When I left for school the next day, Mike was still in bed. When I got back, he was waiting outside for me. He had my baseball and a couple of old battered gloves he'd borrowed from one of our neighbors. We tossed the ball back and forth, warming up, moving farther and farther apart, throwing harder and harder. The ball stung my hand through the thin leather, but I didn't complain. I didn't want to quit. When we finally did, I went in and got my marbles. We found a spot in the shade where May and I had played 1,000 games, but there wasn't a trace of us left in the soft dirt. I drew a circle, and we divvied up the marbles. I let Mike have the ones Ray had given me, but they weren't magic, and he was rusty. I beat him 4 straight. He didn't seem to mind, though. He concentrated harder and edged me in the 5th game, and I was glad. If I'd let him win, he would have guessed it. Mom returned from work. We went to supper. When we came back to our room, Mike had an announcement. He wasn't going to stay as long as he'd planned. He was leaving the next day. He loved us, he said, but he just had to leave. I didn't have to ask why. I understood how it must feel to have some freedom again and then have it torn away. Once he'd told us, and we'd all stood in the middle of the little room and held each other, and he'd gone outside for some air. Grandmother summed it up. Government, she said. Vermin, Mom said. I smiled through my tears.